Hello folks, hope things are going well. If you like what I do, like the video and all that, it really does help me in the old algorithm and pushes me up so that more people can experience the wonder that is hobby nightmares. I considered not doing a video today because I'm going to be really busy, but I figured, you know what, I can find half an hour, 45 minutes to sit down, do some hobby nightmares, take some time out and get this content out to you. But before I do anything, let's dive in, shall we, with Ralph, who says, "Hello, exiled one, Ralph here. Hope you're having a good summer." I am, mate, yeah. I could do with some more sunshine, but apart from that, it's all good. I'm a very new listener of these hobby nightmares, but don't you worry, I've been catching up. My buddy, who is into 40k, recommended you, and I'm loving the content so far. Hearing your takes and reactions to these submissions from a stoic centrist lens, with objective reasoning and the minimum of histrionics, is a breath of fresh air, and I really like the laid-back format and lack of hyperbole that your videos utilise. Yeah, you probably don't like the way that I read, because, you know, sometimes I read like I'm some sort of trained chimp, but there we go. Anyway, compliments aside, the same buddy said that on a Friday you sometimes read out hobby nightmares that are more broad than 40k and miniature gaming. I do, yes. He also said that my old Yu-Gi-Oh story is a doozy and proper hobby nightmare fuel, so I thought I'd give it a type up and send it on. If this gets read out and you're listening, matey, this is on you. So here it is. I'll try to keep it as short as I can, but the more I look back on it, the more mad it is. It happened in 2003 in the south of England when I was 15, and it is with the passing of time that I'm comfortable with sharing this. Okay, I'm just going to say, if this goes into any weird directions, with you being underage in this story, I will stop reading it, okay? Just going to say. Especially considering, spoiler, the police were involved, okay? It kicked up such a stink at the time that it wouldn't surprise me if viewers of this video actually remember this happening. Our school did have over 1,000 students after all. The exact reasoning behind Yu-Gi-Oh's banning in our school has become an urban legend. Nobody quite knew what had happened until now. The most prevalent take was that a Yu-Gi-Oh kid had acted up after losing and had smashed a window. The gossipers needed to have more imagination than that. While they were on the right lines, the real reason was more crazy than any of those rumours. It was my school friend and I who were there. This is a true story of how Yu-Gi-Oh was not just banned from our school, but completely obliterated as a local scene in our entire area. Wow, okay. Our usual locals at the geek shop had been moved temporarily while it was being refurbished. On that fateful Saturday, it was to be set in our school gym hall. Instead of sitting around Kallax shelves of board games, comics, and nerd tat, we were to go into the school building and register and sit on tables that had been already set up. It was a bit weird playing Yu-Gi-Oh in the same place where we played badminton and sat our SAT tests, but cool, we thought. The shop had booked it out. We were allowed to bring snacks and drinks in. It was going to be a fun afternoon of nerding out to win a few booster packs. Good times. The turnout was slightly under the usual, maybe 20 instead of 30 people, but other than that, it was fine. My friend and I rolled up on the bus, walked over to the playing field and went to register. It was the usual crowd of acquaintances and a smatter of new faces. Most of us were cringy teens just like me and my friend. A few kids. A couple of older guys looked the way you would imagine a 32-year-old Yu-Gi-Oh player to look. Some stereotypes were as old as the hills, but they were okay. You would probably have considered us rather OTT as a group, in hindsight. Over the top, that means, for those of you who are wondering. In one of the nightmares I've heard, you were talking about exhausting nerds. Hands up, that was us, mate. Fair enough. Excitable loud voices, quotes from anime all the time, a bit of sugar-fueled hyperactivity from the kids. Not everybody's seen, to be sure, but we were nice kids. Wouldn't say boo to a goose. Well, that's fair enough, man. Like, I do agree that most of my responses to, like, really, you know, loud nerds is from me working in retail around nerds. Do you know what I mean? That's all that's from. So don't take it too personally. My friend, I'll call him Jeremy, and I were having a good time. We were an awkward pair, to the point of being meek. I was a 15-year-old weeb with an emo fringe, a fixation on the Matrix, and a Green Day hoodie. We were the sort of kids who actually found the "Oh really, owl, all your base are belong to us" and SpongeBob funny. I suppose you had to be there. The organisers were with usual guys from locals, along with a younger guy, a university student age, who was on a laptop tracking everybody's wins and losses on an Excel spreadsheet. I played a couple of games, got a couple of wins, before ducking out between rounds to go to the toilet. I remembered the school corridors had an eerie emptiness to them. The floors had been polished clean on Friday evening, and my footsteps echoed through them. I went to the toilets near the front of the building, and that's when I saw them. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows near the school reception. The Chavs. They had the stereotypical clothes. The caps. The sports tracksuits. There were only 2 or 3 of them, riding their bikes around the little mini roundabout that served as a drop-off point outside the school's reception entrance. I thought nothing of this. Without wanting to sound too middle class, they were from a rough estate, with a genuinely bad rep, adjoining the school plot, and I just assumed these were a couple of guys from there hanging out. I went back into the venue, thinking nothing of it. The event went quite well. Jeremy and I were actually the final 2. This is the only time this ever happened in our locale, and to us at least, this was quite a hype moment. Again, I will emphasise that we were cringy teens who watched the Yu-Gi-Oh anime unironically. So to us, this had shades of Yugi and Joey meeting in the cartoon. A sportsmanlike yet epic competitive respectable finale. An intense showdown of friends. Unfortunately, this was not the vibe in the room. If we wanted hype and spectators, we weren't getting it. The clock was creeping towards dinner time, and most people had left by this point. Even as we got our decks ready for the game, the organisers were already packing their stuff away and gave the impression that they were clock watching. All the games up to this point had been singles, but I remember that Jeremy and I wanted to make this the best out of 3. The organiser shrugged and agreed. "So long as you're quick," he said. In hindsight, a single would have been better, at least for me. He beat me 2-1 after I won the first game. It was a good match, and we collected our prizes. It was the most unceremonious prize giving imaginable. By this point, we realised that we were the only ones there. Us and these 2 guys organising it. Once they'd given us our packs with a vibe of, "take these and go home," they were bundling the last of their gubbins together, and we headed out of the sports hall. We went to the front to go to the toilet again before heading off, and that's when we saw the swell of the group outside. We froze. I could see the panic in Jeremy's eyes as our gazes locked, and I'm sure my expression was no different. It was like Hitchcock's The Birds, only with tracksuit-laden teenagers. There were now at least 10 to 12 chavs outside, and some of these were the sort of 17-year-olds that looked like they were genuinely carrying blades on their person. Half of them had sprawled their bikes on the pavement. Remember how putting your bike upright on a kickstand was uncool for some reason? And was sat on a brick wall, drinking energy drinks and intermittently spitting on the ground. Another was kicking a wall for no apparent reason, bouncing off with the force of his foot. Another couple was still riding laps around the mini roundabout. "Let's go out the back," was the general consensus between Jeremy and myself. In our 15-year-old geek manner, we didn't really think to tell the organisers to let them and the school janitor or security know. We just wanted to leave the building without going through that gauntlet, equipped with only our noodle arms and a few trap cards. I was going to say you should use the back way, you know the school better than they do. I'm going to have to take a moment here to say that chavs were no laughing matter back then. Mr. Exile, we were a very similar age, and if you want to input your take here and a sip of the Yorkshire tea, feel free. But people who weren't teenagers in the 2000s in the UK may not appreciate the justified alarm bells here. Chavs back then, in like the early noughties, had a bad reputation. There's a thing in the UK called an ASBO, an anti-behavioural society order or social order or something, right? That they give to people who are just being dicks, right? Just being dicks. That's it, right? Being absolute horrid morons. These are morons who are brought up by morons. They're common as muck. They wear very expensive tracksuits that have been stolen, mostly, right? Or they are knockoffs from China or somewhere, right? They are the general scum of the earth. These are people who have 3 teeth in their head, drinking Monster Energy constantly. You know, not that that was a thing back then, but you know what I mean, right? And ironically, a lot of them, of the chavs, quote unquote, that I knew back in the day are now into rock music, and they're some of those people now, or they're really normal, like excessively normal. Well, those are the ones that I know, but there are sure thousands more out there, tens of thousands, who are literally either dead or in jail or living in a council house, living off of benefits, living off the government. Do you know what I mean? I think the ones I know are the exception to the rule, because, again, these people are the dregs of society, unfortunately. And geeks and nerds and people who are into rock music were not their cup of tea. They would go out of their way to target people like that and beat them up, essentially. And, yeah. There's a very good reason why these 2 young lads don't want to walk through that crowd. It's going to kick off. Anyway. Nerds, or moshers and grebes, as they used to call us, used to end up getting literally beaten up by these guys for wearing a black t-shirt and jeans. We're talking punches to the face and broken noses. I know people who were jumped and had stuff stolen from them. It all came to a head with Sophie Lancaster, which was a horrific case, the Brianna Gay of its time. She was literally killed for what she was wearing by people like this. Yeah. There is actually a charity called Sophie in the UK. And yeah, she was just a girl who was into rock music. She looked like the kind of girl who, if you were 13 to 15, you'd have a massive crush on. You know, if you had to cast the girl from Scott Pilgrim and make her hair not purple, she would look like Sophie Lancaster, right? And she basically walked through a park and got beaten to death by chavs because she was wearing a black t-shirt. Go figure. You know, she was wearing stuff that they didn't consider to be what they liked, so they beat her up and killed her. As you do. You know, and that kind of lit a fire under most people in our local rock scene, because a lot of the older people who would frequent rock bars in Liverpool, they were like, okay, enough's enough, and they would actually go and pick people up from school. These are big biker dudes as well. They would actually go and pick people up from school. Like, don't come anywhere near these kids, or we will beat the shit out of you, right? That kind of, and it happened more than once, where these guys went round to a bully's house and dragged the dad outside and beat the shit out of him, right? Because it was like, well, you let your kids do this to our kids, so now I'm going to do it to you, in front of your kids, right? You can say violence doesn't solve anything as much as you want, but those kids were never bullied again. Do you know what I mean? Like, bullies only need a slap once, right? And they don't do it again. Most of them don't do it again, at least not to you, right? So that was a big sea change in our local area when the Sophie Lancaster case happened, and a lot of the older biker dudes started taking they started taking it very seriously, and we're like, yeah, these people are going to grow up to join our clubs probably, or be in our subcultures, so we're not accepting this. Okay, we will ride around the city and just intimidate you into stopping, into not doing this. And lo and behold, attacks almost stopped overnight because we had, people actually protecting us, unlike the police. But we'll get into that another time. About as useful as a chocolate teapot, the police in England. But we'll get into that another time. Okay. Chavs were a meme, but at the same time, a lot of these lads genuinely wanted to physically harm people like us. So when I say that this was a gauntlet, I meant it. We could tell just by looking at them that there was no way in hell these guys would have let us go past without hounding us, or worse. Imaginings of our cars being taken, thrown around and ripped up abounded in both of our minds, and that was the best case scenario. They had bikes and weren't exactly a pair of Forrest Gumps. And we weren't exactly a pair of Forrest Gumps. There was no chance we'd get past them. And this is when it happened. A couple of them saw us in the building, and a couple of hands pointed in our direction, capped heads turning our way. You could see the malicious, mischievous teenage glee in their faces as they realised that everybody else had left, most likely chaperoned by their parents, and that us two scrawny dweebs were there. In a manner that showed their eagerness for a confrontation and for drama, they threw their bikes down and started walking, shoulders swaying, to the front door as a group. No shame here when I say that we legged it. Yeah, no shame at all, man. What are you going to do? We did an immediate 180 and ran down the corridor to the back of the building. Jeremy and I heard the doors opening and a cacophony of thuggish voices and banging echoing behind us. But we had a huge head start on them. By the time they were in the school proper, we had already opened a set of doors at the back of the building. I remember the wash of relief as the doors opened to fresh air. It was one of the obscure exits of the school that led into an IT block. Then we fast walked and half jogged over the playing fields back to the bus stop. By the time we got on the bus, we were already embellishing the story in our conversations, joking about how we had solid snaked our way through the school. Not true, but whatever. It was just a weird thing to happen, a near miss, an anecdote. All good, right? Wrong. On the morning after, the moment I walked into our tutor group and saw the classroom, the teacher, a woman who I particularly cared for, gave me that strict teacher gaze and said I needed to go to the headmaster's office. This was the first time I'd even exchanged a word with the head. As I say, ours was a huge school with a population of over 1,000. If you were in the headmaster's office, it was either A, because you were a child prodigy who had done something amazing, or B, you were in deep shit, and I was no child prodigy. I was bricking it. The head teacher had a woman there who was a PA and receptionist, with her own little desk, like his very own money penny. She told me to sit down and wait in a chair just outside of his office. This was the bit of school near the staff room and first aid room. Students hardly ever went down here. I sat on the chair, fidgety and nervous. A few minutes later, Jeremy came out of the headmaster's office, and as our eyes met, he looked stressed. I was called in and saw the headmaster sat on his chair. To the side of him, there was a high-vis and black-padded vest of a uniformed police officer. Yeah, because this is what the police do, right? Instead of actually catching people who do things that are terrible, they do things like this. They go and, pester school children. I mean, do you have nothing better to do? His hand was on the table in front of him, and my mouth went dry. In fairness, I didn't need to be so worried. The officer and the headmaster were both professional and gentle. The cop was wringing bullet points down on a notepad. They had seen our names on the registration sheet and questioned me about what had happened on Saturday and wrote it all down. I was asked directly if I had seen the window at the front of the school and a cabinet's glass had been broken. And it was at that point I realised that we'd done our Roadrunner act. After we'd done our act, those chavs had smashed the place up. It was a stressful few minutes, but seemingly satisfied that my account corroborated with Jeremy's, I was dismissed and went straight down to assembly with relief. Before I left, both the officer and the headmaster said that they would strongly recommend keeping the details of what had happened on Saturday to myself. And both Jeremy and I did, in fairness. Though all of sixth form, we never told, through all of sixth form, which is basically college, we never told anybody about what had actually happened. From the head's office, the way to assembly was through the reception, and I could see the shiny, glinting new panes of glass, unnaturally clean compared to the others, with a white sticker on the top corner, newly installed. I honestly can't blame them for the announcement at the beginning of assembly. They said there had been an incident, and the extracurricular clubs on the weekend would be temporarily cancelled. It was no surprise, but it did hurt when they added that Yu-Gi-Oh, and Yu-Gi-Oh specifically, was also banned from the school. Not Magic, not Pokemon, not bringing in a Game Boy Advance, not Games Workshop, not other nerdy things, just Yu-Gi-Oh. Just our game. What really pissed me off was that a couple of the rugby and football lads turned their heads to face us when this was announced. They turned around in their chairs and looked at me, Jeremy, and a couple of our other buddies. They were literal smirks of triumph on their faces as they revelled in our thing being banned. Well, it's not just that, right? You could end up getting bullied for that. These teachers are beyond retarded. Like they're not thinking. You could literally be bullied for that really, really, really badly. And to rub salt in the wound, when the geek shop was refurbished, we got the rest of the gaps filled in. The normies at school were none the wiser, but the gossip mill made the geek shop at the geek shop was on overdrive. We found out that whilst we had been waiting for the bus home, these chavs had kicked up an almighty stink with the tournament organiser and the other guy that were there, the groundskeeper, and the head of sixth form and the police had been called. They had smashed out the front window and a trophy cabinet and had been literally throwing chairs and desks around in a couple of the classrooms before scarpering when the police were called. The shop owner looked irritated and my heart sank again when he told us that Yu-Gi-Oh! Local tournaments and events weren't going to be a thing at all anymore. Not in his shop, not in any venue organised by him and the uni student guy. He told us this, not angrily, but in the manner of a guy who was world weary and just done with it all, which made it worse, if anything. So that was it. There ended our local Yu-Gi-Oh! Scene. They still stocked the packs, and we bought a booster pack in the nerd shop every now and then. Went home and then had to arrange games around our kitchen tables, or not at all. It never felt the same, and I dropped it a year later. I'm long past Yu-Gi-Oh! I haven't drawn a card from a Yu-Gi deck in over 20 years. But it's still a sour feeling that these arsehole thugs ruined our hobby. Not just for me and Jeremy, but for all of those excited kids. I know, I get it. Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't everyone's cup of tea, but we enjoyed it back then, and we didn't deserve to have it spoiled for us like this. Anyway, North, I hope you enjoyed this, and keep up the good work, mate. I'll continue getting through your catalogue of nightmarish cringe in my own time. Thumbs upping as I go. Thank you very much, mate. Likes are very much appreciated. Have a good evening, and that goes for anybody listening to this if you read it out. Ta-ta, Ralph. Brilliantly written, mate. Brilliantly written. Well done to you. Really enjoyed that one. Alright, moving on. Kaelin. Let me take a sip of tea here. Kaelin says, Greetings, North. You can call me Kaelin. I'm writing to tell you about my biggest nightmare. It happened during my first year of university. It was a small, simple thing to the perpetrator, but to me, it was devastating. Here is a little backstory to give you some context. I grew up poor in the rural Midwest of the United States. My family moved around a lot when I was growing up, and I was never able to make any friends because of this. We went from small town to small town, never really settling down until I was almost finished with elementary school. Now when I say small town, I mean small town. The largest one I lived in had a population of 700, and that was one of the biggest towns in the county. These towns were small farming communities, mostly 3 to 5 bars and 2 to 3 churches, with 5 to 10 houses around them. The only retail around that wasn't an animal feed store or gas station was a Walmart that was 45 miles away. I was pretty isolated as a child. I was the oldest of my siblings and there was no other family around us. My parents had plenty of adult problems to deal with, like keeping the lights on and food on the table. With this, they had little time for us kids. There was zero exposure to anything nerdy, let alone the hobby. This isolation and lack of material possessions caused my imagination to flourish. I took pride in being the smart kid and loved reading. Books were free from the library, so I read as many as I could. I didn't have a rough childhood. I was loved and taken care of, but I was sheltered and my social skills were severely stunted. When we finally settled into a permanent place in the summer, I turned 12. I discovered The Hobbit that summer, and it planted the seed for my love of fantasy. I devoured any fantasy book I could get my hands on. It was a great summer, but school had to begin. Starting a new school again, nothing new to me. But it was always a scary time, not knowing who will be friendly or anyone who will have similar interests. Let me tell you, North, this was the worst school for a nerdy, sheltered kid like me. Everybody was related to each other. Most of the kids had known each other before they had even started school, and I was an outsider. They thought I was weird. They thought I was weird because I liked to read and got good grades. No one else had any nerdy tendencies. The interests of all the kids were either sports, hunting, or farming. I had to learn to like football just to even have an outside chance of conversation with anybody. So I spent middle school through high school suppressing my real interests and focusing on something that I had to like. This was right when the internet was coming out and we couldn't afford it, so I couldn't find a community if it wasn't already around me. I learned to like sports, act dumber than I was, and quit reading, but it wasn't me. It was just for show. It made high school tolerable, but I was miserable and I couldn't wait to get out of there. Yeah, I don't think kids these days, I know, yeah, kids these days, but I honestly don't think a lot of them actually understand what it used to be like. Okay, like if you didn't have the internet, which not a lot of us did, if you didn't have the internet, that was it. Right? And then people around you didn't like the things you were into, that was it. It was done. You know? You had nowhere else to go. Being a nerd back then, incredibly lonely. Incredibly. Until some other nerds invented the internet and made it cheaper, then we could find other nerds. With all the good and bad that incorporates as well. But there we go. I selected a university that was 500 miles away, just to get as far away as I reasonably could. When I got there, the isolation was even worse. I was all alone, and my ability to make friends was very underdeveloped. I spent the last 6 years pretending to be somebody that I wasn't. I had no idea who I was, and I couldn't find a connection with anybody. I bought a Sega Saturn game system, and got one of the Madden football games just for entertainment. I spent a lot of time in my room alone, playing. Then one day, near the end of the winter quarter, I was walking through the commons on campus, and I saw this poster with a dragon on it. My old memories of the fantasy realms I'd read about as a kid came rushing back. The poster said there was a con going on the next weekend. It was being put on by the University Gaming Club. I was excited, and I'd hoped that I might find some place I could belong. I spent the week on the library computers, researching the games that were mentioned on the poster. Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer, especially the art, caught my eye and sent me down a rabbit hole. I was excited to meet people who played these games and possibly dive into the worlds that I was discovering. I wanted to join and belong. I needed it. The day of the con came, and I nervously went to the ballroom where it was being hosted. I walked through the doors and was amazed at all the tables set up. Along the outside of the ballroom floor, there was a long line of tables stacked with board games, piles of dice, books, and models. The actual floor had dozens of tables set up for games to be played. It was still early, so not a lot of people were there. I started to look at the stacks and board games. I didn't recognise any of them. The next set of tables had piles of funny shaped dice, D&D books, and modules, along with a bunch of other RPGs. The last set of tables had dioramas of minis and armies on display. I was awestruck. I had never seen anything like this before. I was just wandering back and forth between these amazing piles of awesome when I was approached by somebody. He introduced himself and told me he was the president of the gaming club. It was so long ago that I don't even remember his name. Let's call him Jensen. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Looking back, he did fit a stereotype. Overweight, khaki shorts, button-up sleeve shirt, neckbeard, and fedora. He was at least well-groomed and didn't stink. He was talkative and had an air of superiority about him. I figure he was the president, so he had to put himself out there a bit. Nothing too crazy. We were standing in front of the board game tables, and Jensen asked, have you played any of these? I nervously joked, I've only ever played Monopoly. He looked at me with a puzzled look, and leads me to the next set of tables. What's your favourite RPG? He says. I haven't played any, I reply. None of them? He asks. None, I sheepishly answer. How about these? As he then moves to the armies on display. Warhammer, Battletech, what army do you play? He asks. I used to play with the Green Army men when I was younger, I replied. Now, I was just being honest. I meant no harm in any comment. But the Green Army men seemed to really annoy him. Jensen turns a bit red and says incredulously, well, what do you play then? And me, being sheltered, socially awkward person that I was, answered as honestly as I could. Well, I play Madden, I guess? Yes, I answered in the form of a question. I was completely put out and had no clue what this guy was asking. Jensen then turned into what could be best described as a cartoon character, honest to goodness. This guy then leans back, adjusts his fedora, crosses his arms, looks down his nose and says, "We play real games here." He then spins on his heel and walks away, leaving this image burned into my memory. I was in shock. I just stood there dumbstruck. It was like a bad dream. It couldn't be real. My hopes and joy melted out of me. I was left feeling numb. Now in hindsight, I can see he was just trying to gauge my interest and see what I would like to play. My answers probably came off as trolling to him, but I was clueless at the time and had no idea what he was talking about or where he was leading. Yeah, I think this is a symptom of you both being really socially awkward nerds, right? He acted in a silly way, but I can still see where he's coming from, as you can, right? Your answers do come off as a bit, like, obstructive and childish. But again, you're a very childish person because you haven't had that upbringing. But how was he to know that, right? He doesn't know that. And he's a socially awkward nerd as well, who's probably been bullied all of his life for being into these games. So the slightest hint that somebody isn't taking him seriously, he will act in a way that goes, you know what, fuck you then, and he'll walk away, right? When he turned his back on me, I was shattered. Just another place that I wasn't welcome. I went back to my room and spent the rest of the year in a lonely depression. Like I said, it was probably something insignificant to him, a little annoyance. To me, it was another cut to the wound, and it cut deep. I couldn't even fit in with the nerds, for God's sake. I used to joke that I was too nerdy for D&D, but you know, jokes are made to hide the pain. I was lonely for a long time, and didn't get into the hobby for an even longer time. I'm in a good place now, because this all happened in the late 90s. But because this one guy decided to gatekeep me, it robbed me of a chance to have a more time with this amazing hobby. This was my most impactful nightmare on my long road to finding acceptance with myself, who I am, and my love for the hobby. It was a bumpy road, and I have more if you'd like me to share. Please do, yeah, please do. As an epilogue, the year after my nightmare, I was shocked to find out that the university disbanded the gaming club. You see, the gaming club was an official university club, so they got funding for events and materials. The guys manning the club were also getting gaming companies to sponsor or provide free games and materials to the club. The president and treasurer of the club were expelled for embezzling funds from the club, claiming that the donated materials were purchased using the university's money. They also expanded their own personal game collections by way of club funds, so maybe I dodged a bullet and the guy was a royal douche after all. Anyway, thank you for providing me with hours of entertainment and sharing other stories, so we know that our troubles and joys are not unique and are shared by many, that we are not alone and are united through our love of something great. Thank you, North Kalen. Brilliant, mate. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm really glad you're in a good place now, and I would actually like to know how you got to that good place. Fill in the blanks for me, because you seem like quite an interesting person. So fill in the blanks, write in again. If you want to send in some hobby nightmares, make sure you send them to hobbynightmares@gmail.com. That is hobbynightmares@gmail.com. It's in the description down below. I love you a long time. I'm really glad I got to do this video for you in what has been a very busy end of the week. But I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you on Sunday for our weekly live stream. I'll see you then. Have a good one. Bye now.